The map had come folded 5 times and sealed with hard brown resin that smelled faintly of burned pine. When Daenerys broke the seal and spread the leather on the table in the wind chamber at the Great Pyramid's crown, heat from the afternoon sun made the ink gleam as if it were still wet. The cartographer's hand was uneven, the lines bumped by a deck that had never ceased to move underneath him, yet the shape was unmistakable. The ragged mouth of the smoking sea, the broken teeth of islands that had once been mountains, the smear of ruin where a continent had cracked and sunk. And there, in the middle of pale washes that signified treacherous shallows and black streaks where a quill had torn through in fear or hurry, a mark unlike the rest. Not a dot, not a cross, something drawn like a teardrop with barbed strokes radiating out, and around it a single word in a form of Valyrian older than the Septs and younger than gods. Kept. Kept? Said Grey Worm, reading the word carefully, lips shaping sounds he had taught himself since the chains had fallen away. What is kept? Something people don't want found, Daenerys said. Her own high Valyrian felt like a knife she had used often enough to sharpen with memory. Or something that refuses to be taken. The wind combed her hair as if to take it, the white ringed with gold at the ends, a color some called royal and others a curse. Drogon slept in the shadow thrown by the pyramid's topmost spire, his breath expanding and shrinking the patchwork of his scarred chest, nostrils thin and dry. In the dream breath, thin smoke gathered and dispersed. The ship captain who had brought the map stood with the tremulous air of a man who had done a brave, foolish thing and wished to be paid before fear overcame the memory of courage. He was Carthene, with rings at his ears and an ostrich plume that had bent sidewise in the wind and forgotten to go back. His second knelt beyond the threshold, refusing to let his shadow cross into the chamber, muttering charms against dragon gaze. They stank of the long sea, sour canvas, tar, stale brine. You saw this? Daenerys asked, brushing one finger over the mark. The ink flaked a little. Or you heard it? The sea tells no lies, the captain said. It only conceals them. He smiled as if the sentence pleased him. We skirted the fog to cut 5 days and earn 7, your radiance, and we were rewarded with the sight of memory. The sea boiled and sent up pillars, and something rose in the night as if the dark had learned to breathe. A light, like the heart of a furnace, in the fog, and above it the flight of a shadow, great as any palace roof. Black sails tell lies more easily than white foam, said Grey Worm. He stepped forward in one smooth slide to stand where he could reach the captain without taking a second step. If you have drawn us a mistake, you will not reach your ship. The captain bowed and smiled again with the desperate relish of a man who had found a melody he knew his audience disliked but could not stop humming. The sea tells no lies, he repeated, and looked at Daenerys as if she were the shore he had aimed at all along. But I leave the choosing of truths to those who can command the creatures that make them. He meant dragons, and she did not chide him for it. Drogon lifted one eyelid and let the red within it show like a coal. The captain's throat bobbed. He bowed lower, said nothing more, and looked hungrily at the bag of coin Missandei was weighing. After he had gone, his plume snagging in the lattice, Missandei said, "The word is as old as anything I have seen in the libraries. It has the sense of a guardhouse as well as of an oath. Kept can be a place. It can also be a promise one makes to oneself." Daenerys looked down again at the mark until it swam. She saw her brother Viserys' thin face, pinched by hunger and wanting, telling her the stories of the freehold as if he held its reins. She saw the shadow of a dragon across the sky it had once owned. She saw her own hands, very small, cupped against the glass of a merchant's stall to stare at a dragon skull carved from bone and painted black. Kept. How many things had she failed to keep? A husband, a son, a city that had asked for justice and had taken blood and given more blood and wanted more. Even her dragons had not been hers, not truly, not when they had burned her enemies and her friends with equal surety. But the word did not accuse, called. "Have the ship made ready," she said. "We sail at dawn." Grey Worm did not say that it was madness to cross waters where empty hands came back as stone. Missandei did not say that this city, always restless under her, would shed its shackles and its order the moment her shadow left the last step. They had learned a thing in the long months since she had freed them and failed them and freed them again. She could no more pretend to be what she was not than the sun could be stitched into a tent and carried. They could no more pretend to be safe than the desert could become a garden because water had been poured on it once. They bowed and made the necessary arrangements. At dusk she stood on the terrace, palms flat on the warm brick, watching the light walk up the side of the great statue at the harbor mouth until it reached the level of the face and, finding no higher, went out. She spoke to no one. She had spoken to everyone she owed words to. She had left sentences in the keeping of others, signed, sworn, sent, like grain stored in sealed jars. Wise men would argue over them and find ways to interpret the same sentence into 6 paths. She could not do that work for them, and in this she felt weight leave her shoulders like a cloak shrugged off and dropped to the floor. Drogon came when she called and offered the slope of his shoulder, as if he had been born for this and remembered. She laid her cheek against the leathery heat, familiar and not, and breathed the scent of scorched meat and something like hot iron carried on summer air. He turned his great head to nudge her hip with one careful touch that nearly sent her to her knees. She laughed out loud for the first time that day. "Take me where fire calls," she said into the scales of his neck, "and do not let me mistake my own voice for it." The burning gull cut east under half sails and sullen sky. The smoking sea, from a distance, did not look like any other expanse of water. It looked like a shipyard had burned, and the ashes had been swept onto the waves and smoothed, and then someone had walked across the surface of that ashy lacquer with a hot iron and drawn holes and rivers and figures that made no sense to the eye. The sailors went quiet at the 3rd day's dawn. They stopped swearing and began to move their hands in the air with private games, catching and releasing nothing. The sun rose and found no place to rest its reflection. Standing at the prow with her hair tied down tight, Daenerys saw the world become a room where smoke had sat down and refused to move. Drogon hated it. He paced the length of the deck twice, stretched his wings, rattled the stays, and then crouched with his head pressed against the planks as if the wood were earth and he could draw steadiness from it. Rhaegal and Viserion flew high above the fog when the captain allowed it, and came back with their scales beaded with condensed vapor and their eyes red with irritation. She treated their eyes with cloth steeped in warm salt water, talking to them in the old words, talking to herself through them. She sang when the crew wanted songs and stood in silence when silence was the only thing humans believed could bargain with whatever waited in the fog. The first of the stone men came from the water like a reef that had changed its mind. The youngest sailor screamed once and was silent thereafter. Grey Worm and his cohort took spears to arms that had forgotten what breaking was, and the Unsullied proved that discipline belongs to any battlefield where the enemy is unafraid to die. They pushed the stone men away, and those that clung too long were broken with mallets, and those that broke and floated were hauled out with weighted hooks. Later Grey Worm came to Daenerys with a single nick on his forearm, a scratch that had not broken skin. He had washed his arm 10 times and it was still clean. He stood in the doorway of her cabin and did not ask for comfort or fear. She called him to her and took his arm in both hands, pressing her face against it, smelling oil and faint copper and the ghost of the soap she had sent to the barracks with a laugh, bright as a gift. "We will keep you," she said, reckless with relief. "We will keep you." The fog thinned on the 5th day, not toward morning but toward noon, when dark should be darkest under the peak of the day's brightness. The world opened with a sailor's curse and a tearing sound, as if a curtain too long hung had finally ripped itself from its hooks. The sea of smoke was never empty. There were islands everywhere if one could bear to step on them. Yet this island was different. It rose from the water like a knuckle poked through skin, smooth and black and unwilling to be anything but itself. It had walls, though no human had built them, layers upon layers of glass fused into curves and planes that might once have been lava and had been persuaded to be architecture. And from its central vent, which did not smoke so much as dream outward an exhalation like a nodding head, there was light. Not fire. Not exactly. Missandei said later that it was the color of iron when it is heated to a point where it is about to remember that it can be liquid. Grey Worm said later that it was the color of a promise. Daenerys thought it looked like the tide when the sun strikes it through a break in a storm, how the water is black and the light is white, and between them there is something that is neither but is both. The sailors put their hands over their eyes and cursed softly as if they were in a sept. The island heard her before she landed. That was how it felt. Drogon angled his wings to meet a wind she had not felt on her face, and then, with a rumble that made the captain go to his knees from habit, swept down to the smooth curve of a courtyard whose stones were seamlessly fused. Viserion and Regal circled with a sound like rolling thunder and drew lines of shadow that slid and crossed on the ground. Daenerys slid from Drogon's back and felt heat through her sandals that was not fire and not sun and not fever. She walked toward the vent with the sensation that she was walking downhill when the ground was flat. They stepped out to meet her, or came into being as she approached. She could not have said which. There were 6 of them first, then 10, men and women grown lean as fish by air and hunger, hair silver or black or a mixing of both in threads that streaked their brows and temples. Their faces were cut with grooves from wind and heat, their eyes a dozen colors that remembered gray. They wore garments made of hardened scales sewn into coats when not called to be armor, and they had the air of people who remembered something you had forgotten, not in order to beat you with it, but because it was their work. The foremost of them did not kneel. She bowed. She said a word in High Valyrian. It was not one Daenerys had learned from any school or any eunuch tutor. It was a verb that had never left the ruins to travel with refugees. It felt like the sensation one has when one opens a door into a familiar room in the dark and finds that the room is not where one had left it, but another room entirely, and some dream part of the mind is delighted. Daenerys spoke it back to her. The woman's face did not change, but her shoulders altered by the width of a breath. She looked to Drogon and made the same subtle bow, less deep. "We are the kept," she said then, in unadorned speech. "We are what stayed when everything else learned how to flee. I am Mela." She touched her chest with 2 fingers, leaving a little pattern of soot there, like a constellation. "You are the one who was sent." "I was not sent," Daenerys said. "I chose to come." Mela's mouth made the smallest shape a smile can make without leaving the world. "Then you will be able to leave. Those who are sent cannot find the path out, because it was never theirs." "Do you keep dragons?" Daenerys asked, and felt the question pass through her skin and lodge against something tender in her. "Or do they keep you?" "Yes," Mela said. She turned and led them toward the vent. It was not a vent at all, not in the way that men talked about volcanoes and pressure and ideas that allowed them to portion out the world into things they could pretend to understand. It was a throat, and the walls of it were lined with old glass that had been licked into smoothness by heat and turned viscous again and then rehardened, and it breathed. She felt it, not as wind but as tremor, not as sound but as taste. She put out a hand without thinking, and her fingertips came away with a thin slick that dried at once and left the tips of her fingers bright as if oiled. "They call you Mother," Mela said as they walked along the safe path between stone that looked like steps and stone that looked like steps but was hunger. "But you have no children the old way, and you know it. What you have are bargains. This place does not make bargains. It remembers that bargains were made and does not allow those who would pretend that the world is new to forget. Walk carefully." "I have walked through fire," Daenerys said. "I have walked through grief." "Then you have walked through yourself," Mela said. "There is nothing harder." They came to a shelf of black like a balcony in a theater, and beyond it the light rose and fell, the iron-yellow whiteness that bleached all other colors from the eye when you first looked and gave them back slowly, as if to say see and see and see. The chamber opened downward into a space that the mind could not hold all at once. It was too large and too irregular and had too many planes and pillars and sheets of fused glass like frozen rivers. There was a taste of salt in the air and also of something like blood and something like eggs and something like metal. Heat breathed up in pulses. And below, not asleep yet not active in any way she had known sleep to be, lay dragons. Not newborns, not even young. They were not Valyria no one had seen, nor the mounted beasts of the old families whose names had been peeled like paint by time. These had made their own names by being. She did not know how she knew that their names did not sound like human syllables. Shape named them. One with a back fin like a ship's keel and spines that curved out and forward like plow handles. one with wings so broad she saw for the first time that dragons could glide like albatrosses and not always beat like storms. Their colors were the colors of things that had been burned and remembered heat. Charcoal with burgundy under it, bronze that had gone green and then brown, black like the inside of a kiln when the kiln is sleeping and is not asleep. Drogon saw them and froze, his pupils flaring with a dilation that made his scent change. Viserion whistled, then went silent as if there were a hand on his throat. Rhaegal's fern-green scales lifted along his back in spines she had not known he could raise that high. They put their heads low and their bodies lower and rasped the stones with their bellies as if being taught manners by weather. One of the sleepers stirred, a ripple like the turning of a great fish under a flat sea. Mela stood with her hands at her sides and did not look at Daenerys. "You hear the singing," she said, not asking. "There is no song," Daenerys said, and then realized that she could taste it on the back of her tongue. It was not melody. It had no beginning. It had no end. It was what the heart does without one's permission. "I think I have been hearing it always." "Then you will be able to speak," Mela said. "There is a place for speaking, and there is a place for being quiet. Your kind forget the latter. The dragons never do." They kept her for the length of 3 sunrises, though she did not see the sun. The kept were many more than the 10 who had met her. There were maybe 100, maybe 2. They had children who did not cry at heat. They had old ones whose skin was shining and had gone thin as fish belly, who had not left the island since the doom, and who spoke in a Valyrian that had swallowed all others and been spat back out. They had a place where eggs lay in rows, their surfaces crazed like fatigue crack. They had a place where the kept went to cut themselves and let their blood drip on hot stone that hissed faintly as if pleased. They had stories that were not told with words but with smoke drawn through reed pipes. And if you stood in the smoke, the story was told to your skin by 1,000 hands and not one voice. She slept and woke and dreamed the same, and when she was not sleeping, she walked to the chamber with the dragons and stood. On the second day, Mela asked her to take off her sandals and walk on a path of dark glass that had been worn smooth by feet before men had named glass. Grey Worm stepped forward without words. Daenerys shook her head and put out her hand, and his palm went into hers like the hilt of a blade that had been made for her hand alone. She squeezed and let go and walked the path. It was warmer than her skin and no hotter. At the end of it, there was a place where the singing was so loud it felt like silence. She stood there until Drogon came and set his head beside her feet and breathed, and then the long sleepers stirred in slow-moving ripples that led like thunder traveling over hills. Mela sang then. It was a sound like a woman telling a story to a child just before sleep, and also a sound like a sailor talking to his ship when he is alone because no one else will forgive him his mistakes. Daenerys did not know any of the words and did not need them. Rhaegal put his head down like a dog cajoled into humility. Viserion made a sound like a harp string plucked. The biggest of the long sleepers rose enough to show one ruby eye, then 2, and the heat that came up then pressed tears from Daenerys' eyes and ran down her cheeks and dried as if someone had licked them away. The old dragon was not the largest she had ever seen in picture or skull, yet he was larger than Drogon. He was older than the idea of her. He lifted his head and exhaled a breath in which many birds could have flown without touching one another's wings. When he drew that breath back in again, the world leaned toward him. He saw her and did not see her and then saw her, the way something that had never needed to see changes when seeing becomes necessary. He put his head down. He exposed his throat. Mela did not speak. Daenerys did not move. She put a hand on the smooth plate of scale that would have been his cheek had he been a thing that needed cheeks. The scale was rougher than glass, like tiny dunes of cooled stone. He was warm, not hot, warm as a fatted hound sleeping on a hearth. "His name is Yyr," Mela said. "It is not an owned name. It is the sound of air going in and the sound of air coming out." "I would not own him," Daenerys said. "I would not own any of them." "Then perhaps they will walk with you," Mela said. "And because the world is not made only of oaths and meat and letters sealed with pine resin, but also of hunger and fear and the way men like to hear their own names." Daenerys came away from the island with more than she had brought. She had the long sleepers flying above the burning gull like mountains that had remembered what it was to be sky. She had a song in her bones that told her where heat would betray her and where it would befriend. She had the kept behind her and with her, some of them following in 3 skiffs that could bear that heat without becoming story. She had their not bow and their not kneel, which had become a bow halfway through leaving the island and perhaps would become a kneel someday when she needed to cut an enemy's hope into precisely the shape that would make him step forward into a trap he had made with his own wanting. She sent ravens. The ravens most often came back. Some did not. It did not matter. She had decided without the comfort of certainty and would continue to decide without it. Meereen had not fallen in the week she had been gone and had not grown kinder. It had simply waited as cities do. Men who had been proud in her presence were proud in her absence, and men who had been fearful were fearful. Missandei had sat in the halls where words are turned into orders, and had turned enough that the line between what she could do and what she could ask others to do had become the thin line between breath and speech. Grey Worm had healed. His scratch had not become doom. He had found time to visit the barracks of the quarter that had refused to obey and had told them 3 stories and then told them none and then stood in the doorway and looked at them until they understood that obedience is a kind of love and a kind of fear, and you cannot distinguish the two from the outside. The people came to the harbor and saw dragons everyone had not seen before and thought the world had ended. The world had ended for them several times already. Continued to do so. This time it ended by becoming wider. Some men knelt on the stone. Some ran. Some threw their children into the air, as if the air would hold them up better if it knew it contained future. Daenerys let the long sleepers pass over the pyramid without any spectacle and allowed them to wheel inland toward the hills where goats and olive trees live. They were not a banner. They were not a sword. They were weather, and weather does not explain itself to those who live under it. At dusk, when the harbor stilled and masts made their forest of lines and knots against a sky that had remembered how to be clear, Daenerys called the city to the square. She stood on the steps with Drogon behind and Missandei beside and Grey Worm below, where he could see faces as he had learned to read them. The people came, because people come when the story is bigger than their house and cannot be shut out by a barred door. "We have gone to the place that kept what we have all failed to keep," Daenerys said. Her voice carried because she had learned when to stand against stone. "We have found not only dragons, but those who remember why dragons were made." She let that lie there and continue to fall like ash that does not burn the skin but makes it shine black. They kept their promise when the world broke. We have not kept ours. Not to the free, not to the dead, not to ourselves. We will begin again. The crowd made a sound like an animal clearing its throat. Missandei's fingers twitched once on the rolled parchment she held. Grey Worm did not move at all. "We will begin with law," Daenerys said. "Not words that say what men must do and then wait for those men to find ways to step between each 2 words and make a new thing that the law did not see. A law that is sung in ash and will not break. A law in which no man may own another, and any man who tries will lose far more than his price." She had expected cries. She had expected throws of rotten fruit or rotten sentences. What she heard then was nothing. The square breathed. The sentries on the walls breathed. Someone far away dropped a pot, and it broke, and the shard slid. A woman with a scar that ran from her right eye to her cheekbone made a sound in her throat and then yelled it like a prayer you only say inside. "We will begin with oaths," Daenerys went on. "Not to me, because I am a woman and I will die, and then where will your oath be? But to a thing that will outlast me and outlast you. We will begin with the Concord." Missandei stepped forward at her signal and read. She read in High Valyrian and in the trade tongue and, because she had asked in the morning and had been answered by a nod when Daenerys was too full of a chamber where dragons slept and woke to make the right kind of decision, in Giscari. The words said what words must when they build a house so that men can live inside it. Who must pay, who may decide, who cannot be hurt. How the city will ensure that if harm is done, they will not merely call it by a prettier name and let it be. There were numbers. There were promises measured in the weight of grain and the strength of rope and the width of roads. There was a place for a woman who had done the thing that should not be done to stand and say so without being blamed for not hiding better. There was a place for a man who had refused to do what he had been told was his right to do, and for a man who had accepted the weight of a decision and had done it cleanly. There were offices that had not existed the day before. the voice of the Concord, the keepers of heat, who would oversee the use of the long sleepers' fire and furnaces and kilns to make what men needed, the grain bearers who would ensure that the wealth that was to come from dragon-warm looms and glass and steel did not stick in the hands of those who had always had sticky hands. "Those who sign will be citizens," Missandei said, and the words fell into the square like stones that are meant to make a path. Citizen means you are kept and you keep. It means if a stranger comes and seizes you or your child and calls that seizing a right because he has coin and a whip, every person who has signed the Concord will rise up in the right that is theirs by that same mark and seize him by the throat, and no man will protect him because a coin glinted in his palm. Those who do not sign will not be sold. They will not be burned. They will continue to live and continue to work, and those who sign will look them in the eye and be ashamed, and they will sign later, when they have run out of excuses. Could have broken then. She had brought this idea into a city that had fought to understand even the square root of freedom for more than a year, and demanded that they understand that as a beginning and not an end. Could have broken, but weather had changed the day. The long sleepers had thrown shadows like new roads across blocks that had been always lit and always shadowed, and men had stood in those shadows and felt the air cool and thought of being old men and not just of eating tomorrow. The singing in the stones under the city was fainter than it had been under the vent, but it was there if one's bones had learned the taste of it. A woman from Astapor who had lost her tongue to a slaver's knife before Daenerys had ever seen the city took the stylus Missandei offered, the wax tablet quivering in her hand as if it were a living thing. She pressed her mark so hard the stylus tip broke. She looked at Daenerys and not anyone else. Daenerys nodded once as people nod to one another in markets when they have paid the right price at last. Others came. Not many at first, which is the right way for beginnings to look. Then many. The Concord did not stop ships sailing from Volantis with black sails and black hearts and hooks. It did not keep men from sending letters with beautiful handwriting and heavy seals and threats that made hope curl. It did not make bakers honest or slavers pious. But it did bind something in place that had only been wind before, and when wind hits a wall that does not move, the wind learns to go around, not through. For a year the world behaved like a beast with a bridle it had only just discovered was on its head, tossed its neck, and some men fell. It reared, and some cities came down. The free cities argued in their counting houses about how to continue to milk a cow that had learned to kick. They sent assassins who were used to climbing stones that had cooled in darkness and found that stones under dragon-warm air were tricky and treacherous and stuck to their hands and made them fall. They sent their best readers to read the Concord and find where the words were most human and most likely to break. Those readers returned with ink on their fingers and grudging respect on their tongues, and said that if this Concord was to be broken, it would be broken by those who signed it and not those who stood outside. Daenerys signed the Concord first by cutting her thumb and pressing it against a sheet that had been hardened in gas and heat. It left a print that smelled faintly of iron. Grey Worm signed with the same movement and went back to his work of making sure other men could read their own names and not fear the consequences. Missandei signed and then took her seat as voice, which meant that when Daenerys wanted to say a thing aloud before the law had accepted it, Missandei could tell her no and she would have to listen. Mela signed with a mark that was the same as the word in the map. Kept. Many of the kept returned to the island and many stayed. They became the keepers of heat, not as masters but as those who knew where heat ended and hunger began. Under their supervision, the first forges in 100 years were lit that were not merely campfires for swords. They made steel. It was ordinary steel. It was enough to change the price of a knife in 3 cities. They made glass so clear that wine looked like blood in it and water looked like the air before a storm. They made bricks fuse tighter than any kiln had known. The Concord did not force men to share their knowledge. It made knowledge a thing that could be exchanged for honor rather than hoarded for power. The kept taught the smiths of Meereen how to listen for the moment when a piece of iron wants to become something else. In turn, the smiths taught the kept how to shape iron into hinges that could hold a gate without warping and heat. And the kept laughed like men who had learned that doors could open a new way. The laugh spread. The city changed its smell. And then the first rumors came down from the west like reluctant snow. The night fort had sent ravens into a sky that ate sound and light, and some of those ravens returned with strange frost on their wings. A ship from White Harbor had entered the narrow sea and had not been seen again. and another had come back with a crew that would not speak of what it had seen except to say that the sea had breathed in and out, and the breath had been cold, and the breath had been dead. Men who had never believed in anything that did not fit into a purse began to speak about old stories. Daenerys received a letter written in a hand she had never seen that addressed her as sister. The word swelled in her chest and then broke like a bubble in a pot. It was signed simply by a name that had become a title: the King in the North. He wrote as men do who do not trust words to be enough, but who know that words must be used regardless. He did not beg. He did not boast. He said what had to be said. That the dead were walking, that the wall was failing, that the world had started again in a way that would not favor fire. She had not needed the letter. The singing in the stones had changed. The song had always been heat and weight and air. There was now under it a thin whine like wind over ice on the mouth of a cave. She dreamed of standing on a plain of blue glass and seeing, far off, a figure walking toward her with light in his hand that was not light but memory of light. She woke with the taste of iron in her mouth and went to the terrace and watched a morning come up white as bone. Missandei read the letter and turned it over as if there might be more on the back that would change the front. "If we go, the Concord will stand," she said, not asking, simply testing the strength of the statement aloud. She had learned in the last year that statements altered when spoken. "If we stay, the Concord will be the smallest thing we could keep. There will be men here to break it for pride," Daenerys said, "and men there who will be broken because of it if we do not." Grey Worm touched the hilt of his short blade and then took his hand away, not because he had noticed himself doing it, but because he had taught himself not to make habits out of fear. "We will go where there is need," he said. "This is not a march. This is the thing for which the Unsullied pretend not to have hearts." She wrote a reply. She wrote many. She sent the shortest. Said, "I am coming." It said, "I will not believe there can be only one king when there are so many dead." It said that if there is to be a new world, it will not be forged in one fire alone. She sealed it with glass that Missandei had made with her own hands in a mold carved with a three-headed symbol that was not the old one but something which remembered it and went beyond. She sent the raven, and then she went to the hill outside the city where the long sleepers had liked to bathe in dust. "Will you come?" she asked, because the lesson of the kept had stuck and would not dissolve in convenience. "I will not call you as a woman calls a dog." Waiware looked at her with the same eye he had opened in the vent and breathed a long time. His tongue showed red and black and then did not show. At last he rose and stretched and spat a small jet of blue fire as if testing the air for taste. Drogon loped forward with a showiness he had learned from men and licked the dust from Waiware's jaw with a push of heat. Viserion and Regal circled once and fell in behind. The long sleepers crossed the sky, and men looked up and shaded their eyes and felt the thing men feel when they are about to put on armor and do what their fathers did and their fathers forgot to tell them could end. They went north. The march of dragons is not like the march of men. Men need places to sleep and food to burn and lines drawn on maps to tell them where they are allowed to die. Dragons need air and the smell of their own kind and occasionally meat, and the rest they can make as they go. The fleet cut around the Horn of the World with their bellies tight, keeping land in sight whenever the wind would allow it, and Daenerys flew above them when she could and rode when she must. She learned the habits of cold. "Creeps not as fire rushes," she told herself. "It is a banker. It invests itself in you and waits for return." Villages on the narrow sea gave them bread and fear. King's Road towns gave them pears wrinkled by frost that had come too early, and water from a well that sang as if the cold had taught it the beginnings of a psalm. Men came out to look and did not look too long because fear is polite until it is not. Children came out to look and stared until their mothers pulled them away, even as their fathers pulled their mothers away with gentleness that was fear. They made no speeches. The dragons spoke, if you can call the slow, roaring spume language, and that was enough. They came to the neck and found the air had teeth. They came to the moat and found fires burning in braziers that smoked and a woman on the battlements with her hair bound up like a spiral snail shell, which is a hairstyle that originated in loneliness and redoubt. She had a horn at her belt carved in spirals of pale bone. She raised her hand to Daenerys in a gesture that meant many things. "I have kept this place. I will keep it when you leave. I do not trust you and I would like to, There are men hiding in the water. She blew the horn once. Men rose out of the water like reeds. Then everyone laughed because fear had been fright. Ned, and nothing kills fear faster. They let the dragons drink. The dragons steamed in the cold and shook themselves like giant hounds. Winterfell sat against the world like a hand on a table that has been there so long that it has left a mark. Its walls smoked at the corners in winter as if the stones themselves recalled warmth. The yard filled when the watchers cried down from the towers, and the word passed across the roofs like snow falling off in noisy sheets. The king came out. He was not tall. He was not large. He had the look of a man who had gone into a cold room and had not turned back. He walked as if he did not hear his own feet. He took off his glove and offered his hand. She took it. The heat of her palm made an eddy in the air around their joined hands like a candle draws smoke. "Your Grace," he said. "Your Grace," she said. They did not kneel. They went inside and spoke until the candles had guttered and been replaced 3 times by a boy whose job it was to preempt darkness. He told her what she had already suspected, and it was worse for having a name. He told her of a line of cold moving through the forests like a thought, of men found with no wound and no breath, of a wildling girl who had spoken in a voice that belonged to a man long dead and had said, "They are coming." He told her of the wall making a noise on a certain night, like a deep bell struck once. He did not ask for dragons. He did not need to. "They will burn," she said, and realized the moment the words left her mouth what a fool's comfort she offered. "They will burn for a time," the king said. "But there is a cold so deep that fire is only a kind of bright darkness against it. I have seen it. A man does not forget." "We will learn," Daenerys said. "We will learn what fire must be to unmake what cold has made." He looked at her then, like a man who has been walking at night and has found someone else in the same road wearing boots that make the same sound as his own. "Then we have time for little else." There was not a battle so much as there were attempts to keep the world from ending in front of men's eyes. They went to Eastwatch and stood on stones that had been taught to sing by the sea and listen to the sea shut up. They went to the Hornwood and listened to trees that had put their roots through bones long ago, and the bones had learned the meaning of slow. The first time the dead came was a learning. The second was an argument. The third was a conversation the living had with themselves about whether they preferred death or cowardice. The fourth time there were dragons in the sky that had learned new breath. The long sleepers were not the same as Drogon and his brothers. They had slept in a place that had taught them patience. They had learned to hold heat as a thing not to be wasted. Wyware exhaled and the breath did not blaze out. It spread, a wash of blue that seemed to make the air itself hot. The ice the dead carried, not as blades but as a kind of permission for their presence, softened and ran. When the dead were knocked down, they did not find purchase. When they reached for life, they found nothing. Viserions' fire danced with YYRs and made something that looked like white. A flame so hot it burned the color out of itself. Regal moved like a hunting cat and pressed his body low and blew short, sharp gouts that cut like knives. Men saw this and learned. They learned to put the dead into the fire not from piety but from efficiency. They learned that certain bones would not stay down if the breath had not reached them. They learned that screaming is sometimes a way of reminding your heart to keep its bargain. Women learned how to pull men out from under falling ice without losing themselves. Children learned to be quiet and then learned to shout at exactly the right moment. The Unsullied learned that their discipline worked when turned against an enemy that did not care how many of its number fell. They learned to count in reverse, not by tallying the dead but by naming the living in the moments that mattered. Daenerys learned the cold. She learned how to keep the heat in without letting it boil her blood into frenzy. She learned that fury is fire's favorite trick, and it makes you waste the heat. She learned to stand in the bow on days when even the dragons stayed low and pressed their bellies to earth, and she learned that if she sang a certain way in a tone lower than any she could speak, the dragons listened and found a rhythm to fight to that left them with breath at the end. The king learned her in the way that men learn storms. He did not ask for parts of her. He did not offer parts of himself. On some nights, they walked along the battlements with their breath making ghosts and said nothing. On other nights, they spoke like people in a sick room, quietly, urgently, about things that one would not ordinarily speak of with a stranger. There was not time for love. There was time for something that might have become love if the world had other plans. He taught her the names of places that had become only names. She taught him the inside of a dragon's eye. They kept their griefs to themselves and permitted those griefs to continue to exist, like scars. There was harm. Dragons bleed. One night a breath of cold came through the air like a knife through cloth and took Regal's wing in its edge, slicing under the skin, severing a line of vessels that ran like vines. He screamed and went down, a fall that gathered and then hit with a sound like a mountain deciding to lie down. Men ran. Daenerys ran. She put her hands into the blood and it was hot, and the cold waited with delicate patience at the edge of that heat like a cat at a mouse hole. She spoke to Regal in nonsense and curse and old words Mela had taught her that made your mouth feel like you were blowing glass. He breathed. He did not die. He did not fly again for weeks. She learned then that leadership is many things, but one of them is putting your hands in blood and not flinching until the beating under your hands has steadied. The dead did not become less. They became more until a point came when they could not become more because there was nothing left near to die. That was where the world turned. It turned at a place that had been a village and was now a word used to point. There was a stand of trees there whose leaves had made no sound for a long time and whose bark had begun to shine with a frost that never melted. The dead came like fog with weight, and in their forefront there was a figure that did not belong in any story men liked to tell themselves. Carried neither sword nor spear, carried a silence harder than steel. Around it the cold made a shape like a crown around a candle flickering out. It held one hand up and the world held its breath. Daenerys had not come to be a hero. She had not come to reenact prophecy or fulfill a song. The Kept had taught her a thing so simple men would ignore it until they needed it. The oldest powers are not interested in you. They are interested in being what they are. You must convince them that being what they are includes allowing you to continue to be what you are. She dismounted. Grey Worm made a sound. The king took one step and then stopped, which is love of a kind that trust makes possible. She walked forward into the cold until the cold was in her hair and thinking about getting into her bones. She raised both hands. She did not speak. She hummed. It was not a tune. It was the sound Mela had made in the vent when the dragons had told their bodies to remember the curve of their spines and the length of their own wings. It was heat-made voice. It was humbling yourself in front of that which does not care if you are humbled. The cold listened. She felt it lean. She felt the breath of YYR behind her and the steadying presence of Drogon, who did not understand this and understood it as well as any dragon could ever understand anything human wanted. The figure lowered its hand. The cold did not recede. It altered. It recollected itself around another thing. The ice at the roots of the trees cracked with tiny snaps, like mistakes being mended unexpectedly. The dead did not fall. They paused. You can tell the difference if you are looking. In the pause there was choice, and that was all there ever is. Not conquer, she said, and her breath turned to a plume and a drift. Not rule, not devour, not end. Keep. There must be something left for the keeping. Take the rest. Behind her the king did not shout. He put one hand on the hilt of a sword the way a man rests his hand on the door to the room where he himself has slept when he has invited a stranger to stay the night. He waited as men wait when they do not have any more words that they trust. The cold came forward and touched her as a cat touches the back of a hand it is considering, with a confidence that is the opposite of mercy, and then it withdrew slightly and did not take what was left of the warmth in the ground. The figure in front raised its hand again and lowered it again. It had allowed an answer in a language none of them spoke aloud. The battle that followed did not seem less fierce. It was less inevitable. The dead fell and did not rise in certain places where the dragon breath had burned long enough to alter the song of the stones, where Daenerys and the Kept had built low walls of black glass warmed from within with slow fire that did not go out simply because wind wanted it to. Men fought and lived who had not expected to. Women stood over the fallen and did not have to run because the fallen had stayed fallen. Dogs ran with messages and returned. Horns sounded and were not swallowed by air that had forgotten how to carry sound. The figure at the front of the dead moved like a man trying doors and finding some unlocked and others not. It ended the way most endings that do not become stories end, which is to say it did not end at one time or in one place. It ended in a long series of moments where the dead came more seldom and the living returned to habits they had not believed could continue. It ended with the wall making a sound like a sigh and then not making any more sounds. It ended with the forest starting again, children gathering sticks that snapped with ordinary resistances. It ended when a wildling woman and a man from White Harbor, who had been carrying the same grief for a boy lost at sea, discovered that grief balanced them on a seesaw where they could look one another in the eye without tipping off. It ended when the king slept through the night and did not wake because his heart thought it had heard a horn. Daenerys stood on a hill with grass that had frozen and thawed 100 times and tasted sweet and saw her breath go out and not come back with blue fingers. Regal flew again with a wing that had a scar like a river. Valyria carried 2 children once in a daring flight after their mother had sworn on the Concord that she would never let them be used as the meat men tear from their own bones for victory's sake. Wywire rose and fell and finally climbed until the air was so thin it turned the world sharp, and when he came back down his scales had changed color slightly, as if the sky had rubbed itself off on him a little. The king stood beside her. "It did not end," he said, seeing the same thing she saw. "But it ended enough. That is all any keeping is," she said. Enough. The return south was not a triumph. It was travel. They came back to Meereen and to the island and to the work that waits and does not care that you have been more interesting elsewhere. The Concord had held. It had been betrayed in the ordinary ways, and Missandei had worked with men and women who had learned, painfully, the cost of letting the oldest parts of themselves run their bodies. As if habits were masters. Volantis had tried to send a fleet. A storm had taken half. The other half had found the sea around the island uncooperative. It does not matter whether dragons made the storm or weather did what weather does. Men whispered. The price of a slave in lists fell to nothing. When men could not sell their worst intentions at a price, they found other things to buy. The kept had kept. Some had died. Their names were sung in smoke and then in stone, in tiny white marks you could only see if you put your face to the ground. New children had been born to the kept and to the Concord. They had names that borrowed from words that had been used and from words that needed using. They grew up hearing the humming in the stones and the whickering of dragons and the sound of debates in the square where bakers and readers argued over measurements and the right way to keep strangers safe. They learned to read not only letters but rooms. Daenerys did what she had never once imagined doing when her brother had told her stories of the freehold. She governed. She sat in rooms and listened to men who had learned how to make their voices a form of control and women who had learned the same and children who had not learned restraint for any of it. She said yes and she said no, and more often than she liked she said not yet. She let Missandei say no for her, and people learned that this was not a thing one could steer around by flattery. She wrote to the king and received letters that spoke of the smell of the first green thing he had seen in months, the way it had seemed a miracle, and she wrote of the smell of hot iron and how she had learned to love it when it came from a forge and not from a collar. They wrote not often and not long, and sometimes not at all for a season because there was a world to keep. Mela came and went, walking between a place that was older than history and a place that was trying to become history again. She liked to sit on the harbor steps and let water lap her feet as if the water would teach her something she had missed. She told the children of the Concord stories that had not been exiled to books, about a time when dragons were not soldiers but builders, heating stones to fuse them, drawing glass into light, making bridges that hummed underfoot. The children asked why the bridges had been broken, and she said because men prefer to stand on separate banks when they are learning how to shout. When the first assembly of provinces met in the hall made of fused brick and glass strung like panes of winter ice, people came from as far as Tyrosh and as near as the Olive Hills. A woman from Astapor led the delegation from her city. She had no tongue and no patience with men who pretended not to understand her gestures. A man from Karth came with coins and ideas and found that the Concord permitted ideas but taxed coins. A fisher boy from Meereen came to sweep the floor and then found himself standing with his finger in the air because he wanted to say that if the Concord built great furnaces near the harbor, the fish runs would change. They listened to him. They changed the plan. The fisher boy went home and told his mother that people had listened to him in a room where glass shone like ice. His mother believed him and cried. They argued about minting, not about what image to strike on the coins, though that was argued with good cheer for 3 days, but about whose face would be in the law on the other side. They decided to print a word and a date. The word was kept. The date was not the day Daenerys had come. It was the day the first woman without a tongue had pressed her mark. A date can be a hinge. On an evening 5 years after she had first spread the map and seen the word that had called to her, Daenerys stood on the rim of the vent with Mela and watched Valyria sleep. Dragons do not sleep like men in All or Nothing. They go down and then they come up slightly and then down again. In the light, he looked as if he were lit from within by coals. He twitched sometimes. She wondered what he dreamed. It seemed foolish to wonder. It seemed the right thing. Will they forgive us? Daenerys asked. Who? Mela touched the stone with the toe of her sandal and left nothing on it. Those who wanted a queen to choose for them, or those who wanted a queen to be a story and not a wall? All of them, Daenerys said. There will always be men who wish to be ordered and always men who wish to be free of it, Mela said. And often they are the same man on different days. Forgiveness is a thing that comes after someone has decided who they are. You gave them time to decide. That is more than most rulers give. The rest, they will keep or they will not. You keep your island, Daenerys said. Mela smiled. The island keeps itself. We simply remember. There was laughter from below and the sound of a child shrieking with the joy that arises from being chased by a creature that has been taught not to catch. Valyria had learned to let the children run between his legs while their mothers pretended indifference and did not breathe. A boy with dark hair and light eyes clambered to the edge of the walkway and waved up at Daenerys as if he had no fear of falling or of anything else. She waved back. She had learned not to reconsider the life that had never come through her. She had learned to count. A messenger came running along the path, breath high, sweat silvering his upper lip. He held out a packet sealed with wax that had smudged in his hurry. He looked over her shoulder into the vent and then looked at the toes of his boots because he had become suddenly shy. She took the packet. It was old. It had taken time. She broke the seal and read the handwriting she had come to know as well as her own. It was of weather and grain and a certain white flower that had come up that spring in profusion along the riverbanks. At the end was a single line that was like a breath drawn and held and then let out carefully. If ever you choose to come this far north again, we have built a bridge I think you would like to stand on. She looked at Mela, who looked back with an expression that said, you do not ask me permission, and yet I am always prepared to give you what you think you need to hear. Daenerys tucked the letter into her belt. We have built bridges that go further than any road of stone, Daenerys said. And yet I am greedy. I want to stand on all of them. Mela nodded at the vent. Then this song can spare you a while. Kept you when you needed keeping. That is all any love can claim. Daenerys found Drogon waiting for her with his weight settled on one hip in the posture of a creature that is both at ease and aware of everyone who is not. He had scars now that mapped him as surely as any chart. She put her hand to the warm place behind his jaw where the scales were smaller and felt the buzzing there, the whisper of heat moving. She had been told long ago that dragons are only extensions of Targaryens. It had never been true. They were themselves. So was she. That was why they could keep one another. She flew over cities where men worked glass into laces, over fields warming under pipes that carried heat from vents to roots and made harvests that should not have been possible. She flew over the bay where boats went out and returned at times they could predict, and fish markets where the women called out prices that were only slightly lies. She flew over the sea. The wind remembered her. It tugged her hair and dried her eyes and brought her the smell of storms and the taste of far. Valyrian and Regal fell into formation at her shoulders without needing to be asked. After a time they were joined by YYR, who rose from a place under the skin of the world and came up where the water was deepest, a mountain deciding for a breath that it wished to be cloud. They passed the finger and the veil, and the moon aligned itself in the sky with a lazy exactness that might have been omen and might have been indifference. They came to the river where the new bridge stood. It was not beautiful in the way men like things to be when they want to talk about beauty. It did not rise in an arch thin as a blade or in an impossible leap. It was a series of low spans made of fused black stone and clever iron that had learned how to grow out of itself. It hummed very faintly. On it there were men and women and carts and dogs, and no one was looking downward in fear. They were looking across. He was there, walking with a way of walking that was the same as it had been and different, because men who have kept a world walk differently. He raised his hand and she raised hers, and they did not run or shout or behave like children. They stood where they stood. She brought Drogon down not on the bridge but on the bank, and he came to her over the stone with steps that made the hum change for a moment. And in that breath they heard a note as if the bridge were pleased to feel the pressure of the pair of them. He smiled in that crooked way that had always looked like breaking and was really the opposite, and held out his hand. They did not speak first. They stood together and watched men cross from one side to the other and back again, and heard the hum, and watched a child stop dead in the middle to drop a pebble and watch it bounce and skitter and come to rest. Then they spoke and said the things one says when there is too much to say and only an afternoon to say it, and the rest will be done later if it is done at all. At dusk they leaned together on the wall and looked at the water like any two rulers who have discovered that rule is made not only of speeches and battles but of 1,000 afternoons. They thought dragons would make an empire again, he said, and his voice was mild, like someone watching birds. They were right. They did not know which one. They thought empires were crowns, she said. We gave them bridges. They stood until the bridge's hum had become part of the night's other sounds and the first stars had taken up their old faithful posts. Drogon snorted in his sleep. Wywire drifted down over the water and exhaled a breath that steamed and made a patch of fog that children shouted at. And then he lifted again with a motion that was large and careful as a hand under a newborn's head. The world had not ended, and it would, and between those two truths there was keeping. Daenerys spoke into the dark, just loud enough for the night to carry it back to her when it had echoed across the water and returned changed by distance. She spoke to no one and to the oldest things. Kept, she said, and heard the word become something she could stand on. She did not need it to love her. She needed it to be there when she put her weight on it. It was. The song in the stones went on. The world breathed. The dragons did as well. Those who wanted everything began to learn the lesson that has no end. That to keep anything at all, you must be willing to let the rest go. And if men did not learn it on the first telling, the world kept telling it to them, in fire and law and bridges and letters carried over long distances, in a child's hand pressed in wax and a woman's voice without a tongue making men listen with their eyes. The empire became what all true empires that last become. Not a border on a map, but a way of keeping one another. A way of remembering in heat and frost that promises are what the world is made of when it is kept. On the second morning she walked the bridge at dawn before the carts rolled, listening to the faint hum caught in the frost of the stones. The king walked with her and they said nothing. Ice had its own silence and the bridge had learned a little of it. When they reached the middle span she stopped and put both palms to the rail and felt the slow transmission. N of weight down into the supports and into the river, which took everything and kept nothing but the memory of what had crossed it. He glanced downriver and spoke of breakers he had seen in spring that roared like bulls when snowmelt came in a boil. She spoke of a vent in the smoking sea that exhaled with the same patience as an old man going from chair to bed. When they parted, it was with the courtesy of two carpenters who had measured a beam together and found it true. By midday she was in the sky again, the river a dark rope on her right hand, fields stitched with hedges lying open to the first speculative green. Drogon ate distance as if it were meat. Viserion and Regal bore left and right a little, keeping watch as they always did on the long flights, their bodies arranging themselves without speech into a pattern that hid nothing from their eyes. The wind had teeth and then lost them as the ground fell away from forests to rolling downs to the glitter of waveskin. The sea lifted to meet her. Far out, like a rumor becoming word, Wywire rose. A low hill swelling up out of a surface that denied hills, water sheeted from his back, his wings unfurling with the deliberate gravity of an old tree spreading leaves. He did not need to fly to find her. He found her because she was a thing the world had decided to keep. The voyage back was thinner of escort. She had let most of the ships return by safer coasts. Men strand themselves on the stories they tell one another, and sailors tell themselves that if they have fled one danger successfully, it will turn and grin and let them by a second time as a courtesy. She did not want to waste any more courtesy that way. She rode the air and let the dragons draw a triangle on the pale sky and came down on the island in the smoking sea to the sight of children of the kept being taught to walk along the hot stones by women whose feet knew where the heat bowed toward hunger and where it simply hummed. "You forgot nothing," Mela said, when they sat together to share water that tasted faintly of iron and eggs, which is the only way to keep anything. When you forget, the world takes your forgetting as permission. "I'm not sure I remember enough," Daenerys said. "There is too much to remember for one head." "That is why we teach children," Mela said. "When it is not war that must be taught, it is remembering." They walked the galleries of egg and glass, passing niches where the shell of an unhatched dragon turned slowly from black to a brown that looked warm and then back again, as if the color itself were a breath. Some of the eggs were the size of melons, some the size of a man's chest, one as large as a small barrel that had turned a peculiar streaked color like wood grain in stone. The kept had a name for it that translated only as patience. It had been named by a woman who was old when the doom came and who had died with a hand on that egg. It would hatch when it had decided to. She stroked the shell with the back of 2 fingers and moved on. News traveled as it always had, by rumor and coin and wind. Meereen's harbor was hung with banners when she came down to it in the white heat of mid-afternoon. Grey Worm had set the Unsullied along the quays in a pattern visible only from above. 2 long open lanes, one for arrival, one for departure, and the small craft rode there obediently. Between the lanes were pens for goats and crates for cod, and a place for a mother to nurse while her husband argued with a clerk about weights that had been measured with a stone that was not the stone on the scale. Missandei waited at the steps of the Great Pyramid with an expression that held the twins of relief and preparation in either hand. "Triarchs from Volantis," Missandei said as they walked up together into the cool. "Or their factor, which is the Triarch without the face. He brings gifts, which is to say he brings knives wrapped in silk. The Iron Bank sent not a man but a letter, which is the same gesture with a smaller ransom demand. Qohor sent a smith and a promise that they will send more if we will send them YYR in return." "They may have the smith," Daenerys said. "They may never have YYR." "They have also sent a tale," Missandei said, amused and weary together. "That there is a horn in the west that can make a dragon kneel." "Men make horns to make other men kneel," Daenerys said. "And dragons keep the air for those who refuse." She saw the factor that evening. A man smooth as expensive wood, with eyes like polished stones and a mouth that knew numbers better than prayers. He bowed the way men bow when they want you to know they have rehearsed it, and presented a box of ebony with a lock of gold, and inside vials of spices whose corks had been sealed with wax imprinted with a trident. Missandei took them to be examined later. The man spoke in the trade tongue, careful, measured. Daenerys listened and let the cadence wash over her while she considered how best to put a dragon into a counting room without burning it down. "The black walls hold steady," the factor concluded, "and steadiness offers the world a platform on which to build accounts, your radiance. Volantis appreciates that you have altered certain arrangements with admirable speed, but appreciates more any arrangement that does not alter." "I appreciate oaths that do not alter," Daenerys said, "and men who keep them even when it costs." She did not tell him about the coin stamped with a word. Men who understood only numbers did not put much faith in words until words owned ships. "Tell your triarchs that steadiness will be found, if they steady their hands where they have used them to hold whips. The concord is not an arrangement. It is a door. Men may enter, or they may not. Those who enter will keep what they refuse to share by keeping others, not by owning them." The factor blinked. It was the blink of a lizard caught on a warm wall. By a sudden shadow, the black walls have stood since men built them by means better forgotten, Daenerys said and smiled. "Let them keep the walls if they learn to open the gates. The debate is not over, and I do not intend to end it tonight with your grace and your box. Eat with us. Hear people disagree without killing each other." It is a sound Volantis has not heard in a long time. He stayed. He ate with men and women he would have sold in other cities and kept his hands folded on the table and pretended not to notice that what he tasted was not the food but the manner of eating together. Late that night he stood on a balcony overlooking the square and watched the voice of the Concord hear two cases at once. One about a fence and one about a boy who had struck a man with a loaf of stale bread, and saw the boy be made to work for the man he had struck, and saw the man pay the boy for that work, and saw no one die. In the morning he bowed lower. "I will tell them a story," he said. When he was gone, Missandei let herself laugh into her sleeve until she had to wipe her eyes. There were other stories waiting. A gaunt priest from Lalares cult came with a strip of linen that he said had been washed in holy fire. He offered it to the Concord as a sign that the Lord of Light approved of the bridges being built. She gave him a loaf of bread and told him to feed 3 hungry people with it without blessing it. He tried, and it fed 3 hungry people because it was a big loaf, and when he returned he looked uncertain in a way that might someday become useful. From Bravos there came a calm woman with wind-burned cheeks and a hat lined the color of old blood. She brought a debt tallied by the Iron Bank for the rebuilding of a wall in a city that had not yet joined the Concord but whose merchants had enjoyed the protection of Concord caravans. "We have seen your mark on ships," the woman said. "We prefer numbers, but marks have their place. Some numbers are only marks that have forgotten they started as words," Missandei said sweetly, and asked the woman to walk with her through the glass houses so that she could see what warm root did to winter ground when it was fed properly and tilled on a schedule the keepers kept. The woman tasted a tomato that had grown where frost should have stayed, and nodded and made notes in a tiny book. "If you keep this long enough," she said, "even our numbers will have to change." "Numbers are obedient," Missandei said. "When the world changes, they follow." Men came to Meereen for the heat and stayed because of the arguments. Meereen had been a city of owning and being owned, the power differential so thick you could taste it on bread baked that morning. Now there were committees of brickmakers arguing with smiths about the way heat should be rationed in spring, when the wind from the desert of bones turned and carried dust that settled in vents and made the piping groan. The arguments were loud. The keepers stood among them with the mild patience of people who had stood in stronger winds and waited for the heat to rise again. The first forgemen from Qohor came, 3 of them. A man whose hand had burned to a smooth brown glove that made a joke of fingers, a woman whose hair had gone white early, and a boy who had no beard and a stare like a hook thrown toward a fish the caster knew was there. They put down their hammers and stood before Waiwaiar at a distance that kept their eyebrows safe and watched him breathe. "We can reforge," the woman said after a long time. "We cannot make anew. Whoever told you differently was selling flattery rather than skill. I want not flatterers but men and women who will say aloud what their skill tells them," Daenerys said. "We have steel. It is honest. We need honesty more than we need magic. If magic will come, it will come as obedience to truth and not the other way round." The boy stared at Drogon when he came in to feed on a carcass laid for him, and did not move and did not blink, and then blinked, his face flushing because he was human. "Can we try their breath on what we mend?" he asked. "We will not call it making. We will call it persuasion. Sometimes steel needs to be persuaded." "Sometimes men do," Grey Worm said. He had taken to visiting the forges because discipline has heat and sound, and he liked the feeling of hearing his own heartbeat be replaced for a while by someone else's. "We will stand near with water and sand that have been taught to behave." Waiwaiar's breath did not blaze in the forges. The keepers had learned how to ask for heat that would flow rather than leap. There were failures. Steel cracked when colors were misread. 2 blades made of ugly honest iron bent and stayed bent. But there were successes. Hinges that would not warp in doors that opened on places where the humidity had been slept in by dragons. A chain for the harbor cranes that refused Salt's invitation to crumble. 1 long black bar of old metal found in a ruin near the keels of the smoking sea, which when cut and reheated and hammered and reheated again began to take a pattern not made by muscle or hammer, but by something the metal remembered. The Qohoric woman did not smile. She nodded once, like a person acknowledging that a child had said a word that is always needed and often forgotten, and said, "We will not lie about it. Call it what it is, a relearning. If men will let truth be old, they will save their tongues some blisters." proclamations announced the concord, and proclamations alone do nothing but make paper heavy. It was the small acts that built the way people walked differently. Bakers set aside 3 loaves each morning for the table at the Concord Hall, where the hungry could come and eat without being counted as debtors. A man who had been a slaver and whose hands now made clay bricks brought his daughter to watch the first session of a case in which a man had struck Anno. There with a stool. The stool appeared as evidence, and the daughter whispered to her father with wide eyes when the stool was measured to see whether it had been possible to wield it as it had been described. Men assumed they knew, women measured. The word spread. Here they check even the height of your temper. The sons of the harpy had not vanished. Men do not throw away their masks in a market and walk home to honest work because a law has been read to them. They adapted. They laid down their spears as they had laid down their whips. They took up pens. They opened shops where they sold linen with patterns stitched into it that spoke in a code recognizable to other men with the same education. A 2-headed bird meant a willingness to look both ways when counting coin. A certain border meant that arguments could be had in quiet rooms in the back. The quiet rooms were the old enemy with better table linens. One night, when the new moon made the city a guessing game, a man reached down from a roofline with a wire weighted with lead and tried to take the voice of the Concord by the throat as she stood to drink water on her own balcony for the length of a swallow. He met Grey Worm instead, whose fingers had learned to find strings in dark. The man fell silently the way a bolt falls when it slides out of a beam. In the morning, the quiet rooms were found and their linen was burned and their tables were dragged into the square, and men ate from them for a week and then used the wood to heat the bathhouse where the children came to learn to swim. In Volantis, the factor told the Triarchs his story. He spoke of arguments, of glass houses, of a boy being paid for work after being punished for harm. He did not speak of dragons until they asked him why he had taken so long to come home. "Because what I saw was interesting," he said simply. Triarchs do not hear that word often. It was a seed. Seeds are indifferent to who sows them. What happened next felt like weather. Wind turns, not because men ask it to, but because wind is not a person. Volantis sent a fleet, small, quick ships with oars low to the water and sails that could be hauled down with the speed of regret. They came not to burn the harbor but to be seen in it, and to throw hooks into any boat that dared to leave for the smoking sea with men and women who wanted to put their names on Concord tablets and their thumbs in warm iron. Men on the oars kept their eyes on the beads worn by the overseers because men staring at beads forget to look at the horizon, and because habit is a chain that can be pulled without a sound. A fisher boy from the Olive Hills heard the first oar hit before any in the watchtowers because the sound carried better over water, and because he had learned to hear things through his feet and not only with his ears. He ran and fetched the bell at the end of the quay and rang it until his palms bled. Bells call intentions out of men. The unsullied were already running in lines that crossed and recrossed like a net. The keepers put their hands on the vents that fed the harbor pipes and turned them up until the water steamed a little, until the air heated enough to make the oarsmen blink and to turn the sweat on their backs into an itch that wanted scratching more than it wanted duty. Drogon rolled off his belly into the air, graceless because sleep had its claws in him still, then caught himself and rose with a thump of wing that knocked a woman's scarf off her head 3 streets away. YYR lifted more slowly, a mountain remembering what is expected of it. Daenerys did not shout. She did not descend the steps to offer threats. She walked to the end of the quay and stood where the whetstone had been polished by shoes for 1,000 arrivals. She looked at the foremost of the Volantine ships and at the eyes painted on its prow. Painted eyes look only at what the man holding the brush wants them to look at. Drogon came down low, a hot wind, and put his head down toward the ship as if to say, "I could," and did not. The oars slowed. The overseers looked up. You cannot make a man watch a bead when a dragon is watching him. The second ship came up out of line and drifted. The third ship, whose captain was a man with a face like an old leather purse whose strings had snapped, turned on its anchor chain because he had once seen a city burn and had no intention of seeing it again when his own beard still needed oiling. In the end, they circled at the mouth of the harbor like inconvenient shoals for 3 days, and the city learned how to steer around them with laughter and curses and a few sharp lessons by prow and stern. 3 men tried to throw hooks from the first ship to the quay on the second night. Their hooks bit into stone that had been heated from within. The hooks did not hold. The men's arms ached the way arms ache after dragging an unwilling beast, and one arm came out of joint with a small pop, and in the morning the man's overseer told him that it had been his own fault for having weak joints, which is the sort of speech that makes mutiny in men's hearts without their knowing the word for it. They did not come into the harbor again. Men in black walls argued in rooms that had not felt the day's heat for 100 years. In the end, a letter came with more wax than words, and a promise that Volantis would not interfere with ships sailing east if ships sailing west would carry certain goods at certain prices. Missandei read it and made a list of the goods that the Concord would carry and a longer list of those that it would not. "Do we answer now?" the clerk asked. He was an old man with a pocked face and a love of neat margins that warmed her heart because it was humble, and because humble things keep more than proud ones do without making any noise about it. "After we've eaten," Missandei said. "Letters go down better when the hand that writes them is not shaking from hunger. Bravos sent it." S other message, which did not come as a letter. A girl walked into the city in a brown cloak with a hood that made her a moving shade. She bought a loaf of bread for a coin with a face that had been rubbed flat by many hands. She ate the bread in the square and drank water with her head down, and then walked into the hall of the Concord and looked for a handhold where she might climb. When she found none, she waited, because patience is a virtue taught as a punishment in certain houses. Missandei came to her as she came to all who waited without making themselves pests. "I was told there were debts here," the girl said. She had the sort of voice that has no accent and every accent at once, which is the mark of someone who has learned that ears are eyes and some eyes must be told a different story. "I am here for a debt." "There are many debts," Missandei said. "Name yours." The girl named an amount and a name girded in 7 different ways. Missandei listened and then nodded and went to a shelf and took down a ledger bound in green and opened it to a page where the amount and the name and the girding were written in a hand that had made itself simple by rigor. She drew a line through the amount and wrote a smaller amount beside it. "This is what you will receive," she said. "The rest is forgiven." Forgiven. The girl said the word as other people said God. "The debt was incurred to buy chains," Missandei said. "We will not collect for chains under the Concord, and we will not pay for them. We will pay for bread sacks, and we will pay for shoes, and we will pay for the hemp rope that holds up the nets that keep men from falling while they build the aqueduct, because those are the sorts of debts that keep men alive. Tell your bank to itemize. If it does not, we will estimate on the side of life." The girl did not move for a long time. Her face arranged itself into a mask of polite incomprehension, and then the mask slipped, and underneath the mask there was a child's surprise. "You think you can teach Bravos how to count?" she said at last. "I think Bravos has been teaching everyone else to count for a long time," Missandei said, "and may profit from being told that counting is not the same thing as keeping. We are very happy to do the sums together if your bank sends a man who can hold both numbers and a child's hand. You can tell him that in exactly those words." She leaned in very slightly. "And tell him too that if he sends an assassin with a face that is anyone's face, the keepers will feel the heat change when that face crosses the threshold, and it will be an interesting day." The girl's mouth twitched. It was not a smile. It was the recognition of a game whose rules are as old as paying for bread. She took her coin and went away and did not kill anyone that week. The copper smell of blood did not haunt the hall that month. Daenerys believed that habits had been changed and not simply tactics. She might have been wrong. She was content with being right often enough to keep people alive. The island in the smoking sea was changing too. Heat changes everything. Pressure changes more. The kept felt it in bone and breath that the vent was learning a new rhythm. The singing went up half a tone and then down a quarter and then up again, which might have meant nothing, or might have meant that the throat had been rubbed raw by the breath. "The doom was not an event," Mela told Daenerys bluntly, as they stood over the wide opening where the glass was smooth as if a giant's thumb had stroked it for 1,000 years. "It was a habit. It is a habit returning to itself. We have diverted it with song. We must do more." "What songs are there left to sing?" Daenerys asked. "I have hummed to cold and hummed to fire, and they have both chosen to let us live. I do not know what to ask of stone." "Do not ask," Mela said. "Teach." Stone does not know that it is allowed to do what it has not done before. It does not know anything, but it remembers pressure. We need to build new mouths, so that the old one does not choke. New vents, Daenerys said, and it felt no more ridiculous than telling a river to find a new channel. Rivers do this. Why not heat? How? With dragons, Mela said, and smiled at last. A small wicked smile of someone about to dare a mountain to dance. And men carrying the sort of metal that will not go soft when it looks at a dragon. They built the first great ring out of that relearned metal. Black, shot with a sheen that looked like oil in a puddle, banded with etched grooves that would hold when the glass tried to loosen its grip. The Kohoric forged it over 6 weeks, while the keepers sang to keep the heat even, and the Unsullied stood outside the foundry with damp cloths wrapped around their heads and did not let curious apprentices wander in, because curiosity kills quickly when heat is allowed to be a god. When the ring was lifted, by cranes and by dragons together, a wedding of old muscle and new habit, it rang with a note that made people's teeth ache, a sound like a bell under a river. They carried it on 6 sledges that were not sledges but triangles of ceramic set on stone powder that had been taught to behave, and the keepers walked before it with their hands up, testing the fit of air. They brought it down into a valley where the world had tried to make a vent once and failed. There was a depression there in the glass like a thumb press in dough, and fractures radiated from it like poorly drawn lightning. Underneath they could feel heat sulking, wanting to rise and being turned aside. The kept assembled on the surrounding shelves, all of them, even the children, even the old. Mela lifted both hands, as if to quiet a market, and then let them fall. The keepers hummed. It was not one note. It was a moving pattern, the sort of sound you can only make if you have taught your body to count and taught your throat T. Obey count without changing what you know a note wants. YYR lowered his head. Drogon opened his mouth and rumbled, then found the pitch, then found the second that Mela made with him, and then, obedient as a thing that has always been itself and yet can be taught, leaned into that second and made it broaden into a third. Regal and Viserion fitted themselves into the moving lattice of sound until the air itself parceled out, squares of heat and cold interleaved like checkerboard cloth. The Kohoric woman signaled, and the men hauled the ring to the margin of the failed vent. Now, Mela said quietly. The dragons exhaled. It was not the scream of a wall of fire covering a field. It was a slow breath, laid along the ground like a hand laid on a feverish brow. The glass at the edge of the depression flowed and then stiffened and then, lured by the etched grooves of the ring, embraced it. The ring slid as if it wanted to be embraced. The kept stamped their feet in time with the humming, making small tremors that taught the larger tremor what rhythm it should keep. Heat rose, testing. It met an edge that held. It did not argue. It rose along the inside of the ring and, like a guest shown to a new door, came out where it had not come before. The valley filled with breath. The note the ring made changed, a harmonic appearing high and silver as a bird. The old vent lowered its hum a fraction and did not push as hard. Took a day. Men ate standing up with one hand while they held ropes with the other. Children slept in laps behind boulders that sweated with heat. Daenerys stood a long time with her eyes closed and her palms out and felt the way her skin learned the new song. When it was done, the valley did not look changed. A ring lay around a mouth where no mouth had been. Heat rose. No one was dead. Mela wiped soot off her face and looked like a woman who had seen an enemy smile and then decide to leave after all without breaking anything. Again, she said, and they did, in another valley and then a third. By the end of a season, men who had not cared to learn the kept words could tell by the sleep of the air when a vent wanted a friend, and could say so. The concord grew the way vines do, toward heat and light and something to climb. A council hall rose in Astapor, fed from small vents that had been coaxed awake in the red foothills beyond. The woman with no tongue presided there, her hands eloquent and her eyes sharper than knives. Yunkai sent a delegation that wore sashes of yellow and pride that chafed under the arms. Daenerys went to meet them with bread and salt and a promise of warmth for the kills where their tiles were made, and without promising anything else, and they went home confused and angry and halfway to becoming allies. In Volantis, A boy with an arm that had forgotten how to obey after a break reached too soon for a heavy bucket, learned to stretch and carry again in a bathhouse heated by one of the first pipes snuck under the black walls. And the man who had installed it pretended he had not cried when the boy lifted both arms above his head and laughed as if heat were a gift meant for him. It was not all building and breathing. The world sees a woman trying to make it larger and decides, as if by habit, that it will try to make her smaller. A horn was blown across the water in the west one night. It came to the kept as headache before it came to them as sound, and the sound when it arrived was not music but longing in metal. YYR rose from his ledge with his head tilted, as if hearing a name that belonged to him but had been given to something else. Drogon hissed and stayed where he was, the old scar along his left wing puckering, memory made flesh. Viserion shouldered YYR and YYR shuddered. A great involuntary twitch in which the old rings set in the valleys chimed with tiny crystalline protests. "What is it?" Grey Worm asked. "An instrument made for cowards," Mela said with sincere contempt. "It promises to do the work your spine is supposed to do. It tells things they must obey, a will that is not even present. Do not fear it. It is not music. It will not endure." "This ring was not made in Karth," Daenerys said, stepping toward YYR with her hands up and her throat opened by a breath that had nothing to do with air. "This ring was not made in Volantis. This ring is your name. Remember." She did not sing. She hummed what she had learned. Stone tone, air tone, heat tone. And the keepers joined her, and the sound laid itself around YYR like a mantle and reminded the air that it belonged first to itself and only afterward to anything that wished to ride it. The horn's sound became less. It sputtered and tried a new pitch and then fell away as if its blower had run out of chest. They sent out skiffs. In the morning, the skiffs found a ship with a broken mast and a smell of foolishness. On its deck lay a thing of black iron bound in red gold, inscribed with symbols cut deep as certain men cut their names into tables simply to feel a mark that cannot be washed away. The thing was cracked from end to end. Inside it were traces of something like spider silk that had melted and then set again and then melted. A man lay beside it with his mouth strangely shaped, as if at the last he had decided he could spit up his own folly and had only realized too late that folly has no throat. "We will take it apart," the Cohoric woman said, with a craftsman's interest that is different from greed and more dangerous. "If we can be taught how it took hold of a mind, we can be taught how to unmake such a hold wherever men try it. If we cannot, we will throw it into a vent mouth and let the world digest it. Show it to the child who will inherit the vent," Mela said, "and to the old woman who has fed it with her blood. Show it to the man who cleans the pipes and the woman who keeps a table where men who have lost their work come and eat soup and feel that the world continues. Show it to every pair of hands that keeps this place and then ask them whether it should live under our eye. We will obey the majority as if it were an ancient god." They did. The hands voted to study the horn, not to use it. The study took months. The conclusions were what Daenerys had expected. It was a training for obedience disguised as a call to strength. It would have worked only on a creature who had already been taught to listen to men more than to itself. YYR had not. Drogon never would. They took it apart, then melted what could be melted, and made out of the gold 3 thin rings that children wore as prizes in a game where you had to run across hot stones without lifting your feet too high or you lost the mark of the song. In the north, the bridge gathered stories like a shawl gathers burrs. Men told of a woman who had given birth in the middle of the span because she had insisted on crossing it to see whether it would hold a new life. They told of a cart that lost a wheel and did not tumble into the river because a boy had had the presence to wedge his body under the axle and a man had thrown a rope exactly right at the second turn. The king wrote seldom and wrote well. He spoke once of a white stag seen in the new green of a copse and the pause the whole hunting party had felt, as if a god had yawned. She wrote him that he should not waste prayers on stags, that there were children to teach to swim and iron to be mined where the earth had softened its grip after a winter of stubbornness. He wrote back that he had not prayed. He had admired, which is different. She wished very suddenly that she had a year to admire anything. There was a winter that came in wrong, sly, falling on the olive hills so fast the first olives turned black and then brittle before the picking could be done. The Concord learned then what its warmth was worth. The keepers diverted heat from the forges to the glasshouses for 3 weeks without notice. Men learned to bind up olive trees with much laughter and cursing, and hands turned black with oil. And the harvest was not lost, only late. Volantis sent a letter that asked whether it might buy glass to extend across certain streets to keep rain off the heads of triarchs in parade. Missandei did the accounts at once. The glass it would take could instead roof 500 spans of market in a city with no triarchs. She sent the figures with a note that said, "If you will feed the 500 mouths that glass would shelter when rains come, we will send you glass enough for your pomp." They did not answer. The 500 ate that winter regardless. To the west, across the narrow sea, rumors there gathered like cloud. Some said a red ship had tried for the Dragon Island and found black waves. Some said a man in a tall crown woven of kelp had promised to ride a dragon with a horn made from a sea king's bone and had instead made himself a cough that ate him piecemeal. Some said a city of gold had sunk a foot lower into its marsh because its walls had been convinced that height is pride and pride makes poor ballast. The rumors came to Meereen and were chewed over by men with their sleeves rolled up to the elbow. Meereen had developed a taste for stories as one develops a taste for a strong spice. Cautiously at first, then with a laugh. It fed the city as much as bread did. She had begun to believe that the keeping might continue without a blow that knocked everything off the table. It did not, because nothing that matters continues without being tested by a sudden hand. The blow came not from Volantis and not from Bravos and not from any man with a horn or a coin. It came from under them, from the habit of the world. The oldest Vent's song cracked one morning like a cup dropped on a stone floor. The note went high and thin, then fell out of hearing and settled to a hiss. Men in the glass galleries looked at one another and did not look at the cracks that had appeared along the old seams, hairline, like crazing in glaze. The youngest of the keepers put his hand on the stone and wept without any sound. Mela ran. "Not a doom," she said, when the first panic had quieted to a level where listening could be done. Panic is sound, not meaning. A complaint. The old throat is tired. We ask too much of one place while we taught the new places to speak. It is like relying on one old woman to carry all the loads because she knows the way to market. It is not a crisis. It is a correction. How do we correct the correction? Daenerys asked. By telling the new throats to take more of the song, Mela said simply, and by spoiling the old one pampered for too long. They let the oldest Vent go hungry. It was the hardest thing the Kept had done since the Doom because it went against everything they had taught themselves about gratitude. They dampered it with new rings that narrowed its mouth and obliged its breath to go elsewhere. They raised the heat under the young Vents, coaxing and then insisting. Heat is stubbornly obedient. If you train it to go a certain way and then tell it to go another, it sulks and grumbles and then goes. A year later, the old Vent sang lower, richer, like an instrument that had found its sound after straining to be heard, and the new Vents had voices of their own. The island had learned to be an organ instead of a flute. During that year, the Concord learned another lesson about keeping. A caravan went west with glass for a city that had signed a week before. Men rode with it who had worn the sashes of Yunkai previously and had taken them off and folded them carefully and put them in a chest where they could be revered and not obeyed. Bandits fell on the caravan on the second day out, the sort of men who have not yet chosen how to be in the world when the world has changed. The caravan guard fought and did not break, and the bandits fled. 3 days later, the same bandits aimed back, but one was missing. Dead of a wound that had gone sour, they said. The caravan's captain was a woman who carried her spear with the competence of someone who had starved only once. She did not kill them. She had them walk with the caravan for a day and carry loads and eat with the men they had tried to kill and, at night, told them the Concord's rules. In the morning, she gave them each a loaf. 2 went away and returned a week later to sign their mark with awkward hands in a hall they had once stolen from. The 3rd walked east and was killed by men who had not yet learned the rules. Keeping does not reach everywhere at once. Marwyn the mage came to Meereen, as men like him come to places where stories are being made and want to be read before they are set on calfskin. He smelled of oils and old ideas and ships that had eaten rats. He did not come to examine Daenerys as a specimen the way certain men in Old Town would have. He asked the keepers questions that were so simple they seemed insulting until you tried to answer them. They liked him because he listened even when he was not getting what he wanted, and because he did not flinch at heat. He brought a small bundle wrapped in greasy cloth, a bar of steel that had once been the ruined rib of a bell. It sang very badly, he said. Now perhaps it will learn. It learned. Under the breath that had been taught to roll like oil and cut like frost, the steel changed texture. The Kahoric woman hit it twice and listened with her ear to it, the way farmers listen to soil to tell if the beetle is still there. Not Valyrian, she said. We are not gods, but not what it was. It will hold an edge longer than our father's edges held. It will not fear wet. It will not be ashamed to go to war and then go to plow. She grunted, which was for her a laugh. It will be a very useful friend. News of that made men in King's Landing, if there was a king there, and there always was some kind of king there, stare down at their own nearby island and wonder how much dragon there was in the stone beneath their feet. It made men in Old Town argue all night and lose their tempers and then find them again in the morning under a teacup. The Citadel wrote a letter that said nothing and everything, the way letters do that try not to say, "We do not understand this and we fear it." She sent them back a polite account of how to clean vents when salt gathered in the throats in certain winds. "If you keep your chimneys open," the letter concluded in Missandei's hand, "you will breathe better." That is not a metaphor, Archmasters, but it could be. It is a strange thing to live in a world that is not ending. Men who had taught their sons how to die now had to teach them how to live. It is harder, takes more steps. A young Unsullied who had done his work without regard for what his next day would be stood at the edge of the fish market one morning and watched a girl pluck a song on a stringed instrument that had been made of reeds and a bowl and a gut. He stood there until the stall-keeper thought he was planning to steal and told him to be off. He did not move. Grey Worm saw him and took him to where lessons were being given, and the young man learned to hold a brush instead of a spear and to wipe the brush the proper way so that the hairs would keep their shape. Within the year, he was drawing maps for caravans that went to places no one had dared to go before because they had been told all their lives that there was no safety anywhere beyond the square. "It is not safety," he said in the market to his mother, whom he had not seen in 2 years. "It is knowing which danger you have chosen, and keeping one another while you walk through it." His mother slapped him and then hugged him and then called him arrogant. He liked that she could. Daenerys grew used to walking without escort through markets and hearing arguments wrap around her and go on, used to having her name shouted and worshipped and reviled and ignored as if she were a weather vane and not a woman. She was worshipped in some cities. She discouraged it where she could, and where she could not, she turned it toward feeding the hungry instead of beating drums. Once, in a city near the edge of the Dothraki Sea, riders came thundering in and circled the square, their hair bells ringing with a sound that made the goats nervous and the old women nearly spit in reflex. They had come to seize and rape and shout because that had always been their way. The first dragon came around the curve of the old city wall and opened his mouth and held the heat there without letting it out. A lamp brought near a moth-slicked window. The riders' horses smelled that breath and decided they did not like it and sat down on their haunches and refused to move. The riders shouted. The horses shut their ears. The dragon lowered his head and nuzzled one horse on the flank, and the horse bolted and then remembered it was safer not to. It took an afternoon, but in the end the riders rode out again with sacks of grain on their saddles and a promise in their mouths that they would bring more sacks next season from the new fields they would dig. You cannot teach a man that a way of being a man is wrong. You can show him a way of being one that leaves him whole and let him try it on for size. Sometimes it fits. There were children in the keepers' houses with hair white as bone and eyes the green of old copper. There were children with hair as black as an otter's wetback and skin the color of olive wood, and their laughter sounded the same. They were not taught to love dragons. They were taught not to fear them. Dragons are weather. You learn which way the wind is going to blow, and you do not expect it to learn you. The children learned the songs the way children learn the names of their mothers, without trying, as something that comforts when it is dark. They learned a hum for cooling metal and a hum for opening a vent and a hum for calming a goat during kidding and a hum that brought Drogon down from the sky when the wind had gone tricky and cross. They learned how to put hands on eggs and feel whether they were impatient. One child put his ear to an egg in the row called Patience and listened, and then spoke to no one for a week because he did not want to share yet the sound that had come up through his scalp like water rising through sand. When he did speak, he said, "It is going to be a dragon that knows how to go under the sea." And the old men laughed because they had never seen such a thing. When Patience hatched, the dragon that came out slid across the hot glass as easily as eel across wet rock, and dove into the warm water of the pools with such joy that the old men shut their mouths and resolved to watch before they laughed next time. Letters came. Letters always come when men can put them on ships that are not needed for war. The king in the north wrote of lambing and of quarrels with the lords of the stony coasts, who seemed to believe that land ceased at their hedgerows, and that beyond hedgerows there is only a place where the wind goes to die. He wrote of children who floated fir boughs downriver with candles on them at dusk, and of how the river took them without complaint, and of how, once, a candle had gone out and a boy had waded into the cold to relight it with a flint and a look on his face that was a prayer and a dare at once. She sent him a small piece of glass made in the shape of a river stone, smooth, that sang when you struck it lightly with a nail. "When you can no longer hear the singing," she wrote, "send for us. We will come again." She did go again north once more before her hair had silvered. Not for war, for a wedding. A girl who had survived the snow by the thinness of an eyelash married a man who had learned to coax potatoes from a field he had thought barren. They married on the bridge. It hummed while the words were said, and if bridges can feel pleasure, it felt a little that day. Drogon lay his head on the stone like a hound and watched with one eye. YYR circled once and blew a small cloud of steam to turn the midges away for the length of the vows. The king stood by and said only, at the end, "Keep." And the crowd, who had never heard a word used as an order and a blessing at the same time, shouted it back, and the sound went downriver and was made into a story by the first men who heard it after it had passed under the third span. Stories like heat spread if not confined. Missandei grew older and cleverer and more certain. She made mistakes and apologized for them in public, which is a thing rulers do not do if they want to be adored. She did not want to be adored. She wanted the concord to work. She sent men away from her table when they came to talk about their son's advancement, and invited them back when they came to talk about whether the heat in the glasshouses could be turned down by 1/4 at noon and up by 1/3 at midnight if a certain wind kept coming out of the west. She married a weaver who had taught himself how to weave patterns that could be read as numbers by men who could not count, and who spoke when it was useful and was otherwise content to watch her speak. She and Grey Worm argued twice a year loudly about how much training should be compulsory and for whom. Sometimes he won, sometimes she did, sometimes the children did, because children have a way of breaking the locks every plan sets on them for their own safety. When Missandei died, it was in her chair at the table, in the middle of drawing a line on a piece of paper showing how heat should be apportioned to those districts that had been too long used to getting too much. The line ran off the page because her hand had forgotten it needed to stop. Men cried in doorways. Women did too. The city went quiet for one day and then argued again, which is the only monument she ever would have chosen. Grey Worm did not leave the Unsullied. He did not marry. He had been told once that there was a whole part of life he would not have, and he had made himself a new part and found that it was enough. He presided over a school in the mornings where children learned to shout orders clearly, so that if one day they had to be frightened, they would be frightened politely. In the afternoons, he went to the forges and listened to steel being persuaded. At nights he walked the hot paths and told the stones aloud which men in the city were most likely to forget their oaths before breakfast, and which could be trusted to hold a quiet in the middle of a brawl. He had a way of speaking to walls as if they were comrades. He retired the day he stood at the harbor and realized he had begun to count steps between bollards without knowing he was doing it. He put his short sword on a table at the hall and took instead the ledger with the names of the young and wrote beside some of the names. Does not run from noise and beside others. Hears a lie and beside others. Learns to read without resenting it. He died in his sleep in a room that looked toward the sea. On his table there was a list of men who had paid for bread the day before. There were no statues. In the morning there were boys at the drill square who did the next exercise the way the men before them had done it, and who laughed afterward the way men laugh when they discover that they are not expected to be better than men, only as good. YYR did not die. Dragons do not have deaths we can recognize unless we force our deaths on them. He grew slower, and then he grew slower again, and then one spring he did not come when called to the net of song, and the kept found him adrift of rock off the smoking coast. His wings spread a little, heat sighing through him like wind through an empty hall. They sat with him 3 days without speaking. When he breathed again, it was a breath that said, "I will be less now," and he was, and this did end. Ot trouble him. He had learned in his impossibly long life that there is a difference between being less and being gone. Drogon kept to him more after that, like a son who has discovered that his father's hands shake a little when he eats and who pretends not to notice while taking the heavier pitcher of water without anyone having to ask. Patience hatched a clutch of eggs in the 21st year of the Concord. They were odd eggs, green-black with veins like silver running across them, and the dragons that came out were restless as fish and content as snakes. And when they were 6 months old, one of them went into the sea at dusk and did not come back all night. And in the morning came out of the water a mile down the shore and shook itself like a dog and sent a spray that smelled of kelp and steam into the faces of the children, who screamed with joy and revulsion. "You see," the boy who had heard the water through his scalp said to the old men, who pretended not to be astonished, "Under the sea and not dead. You owe me a loaf, Mela." Mela gave him 2, and rubbed his head, and watched the dragon go under again and wondered what song water sings when it is this close to fire. On the day the first census of the Concord was to be announced in the square, a grand moment that meant little to anyone but those who had struggled to count the uncounted. Daenerys went up onto the roof of the hall very early and watched light walk its way down the tiles of the far roofs. The census had been her idea because mercenaries cannot eat promises and numbers feed armies better than rhetoric. She liked numbers that were true. They let her sleep. The tally would say there were more mouths than a year ago and more bread for those mouths and slightly less theft and slightly more learning. It would say the Concord was not a dream being told to children while their mothers boiled thin soup. It would say, "This exists." She sat with her back against a flue that hummed faintly with borrowed heat and thought of a girl who had walked through a city with bells and knives and promises she could not keep, and of a woman who had stood before a throne in a place where men had made a seat out of what they had taken from other men and had thought for a moment that this was what it meant to rule. She had unlearned that. She would have liked to tell the girl and the woman both that ruling is 3 cups of cool water in a line handed down a row of hands that do not drop them. She would have liked to tell them that love is a bridge of fused stone humming very faintly underfoot and not a crown that digs its teeth into your hairline. She would have liked to tell them that dragons are not a solution. They are a pressure. What you do with pressure is what makes you. The city stirred below. She stood up. The square was full. Men and women had put on clean shirts for the occasion, because they had shirts now they could afford to keep one for special days. Children climbed shoulders and were hauled down. Missandei would have read the numbers, and they would have cheered at the parts where the amounts went up and gone quiet at the parts where they did not. She opened her mouth to speak. She never found out if the word would have been people or friends or here because a sound came from the south then, like a field of glass cracking under a foot. It was distant and immense. It made birds rise everywhere. She put her heel down hard into the stone and felt the hum through the flue change a fraction. Men flinched the way men do when they hear a word they have been trying to forget for 20 years. She did not think doom. That would have given language the victory of panic. She thought correction and turned to Grey Worm, who had already turned to the keepers, who had already begun to sing. The song went up around the square as the flue hummed higher and the air tasted like a spoon heated over a candle. An old vent had woken. No. Something under an old vent had shifted in its bed, and the bed had not liked it. The squares emptied as men and women did not run but did walk briskly toward places where they had been told to walk if certain notes were heard. The square emptied of everyone but those whose work it was to watch. She looked at Drogon and his pupils were narrow as threads. His wings held half open, waiting. "Do not show yourselves yet," she said to the dragons. "Let the kept sing first. If air can be persuaded, we will not waste heat." They sang the new low song that reminded old throats how to be lazy. It is not a small thing to teach a mountain sloth. It requires patience you do not have and must find in your feet while you sing. The note changed. The hum in the flue calmed. Out on the edge of the sea, a thin column of steam rose, straight as a rod. and then widened into a fan and then faded. She put her hand on Drogon's neck. "Good," she said, "to him and to the city and to the world for once remembering how to be teachable." After, the square filled again, as squares do when men have discovered that they still have a use for standing around in them. Missandei read the numbers. They were what she hoped. After she finished, there was a pause that was not discomfort or doubt, but the end of a long sentence people liked the sound of. A brickmaker shouted the first word he could think of, and it was not Concord or Kept or Daenerys. It was bread. Everyone laughed and shouted it too. If you can make a city shout bread in joy and not hunger, you have made something. She went to Mela that night with a loaf tucked under her arm, and they ate it together on the stairs above the vent, and it tasted like the ordinary miracle that it was. Years moved as they move for those who do not spend them dying. The first riders without the old blood were chosen when it became clear that dragons are not fools. They go where they are respected, and they lower their heads for those whose hands have taught them to expect teens. A woman from Noth with a wrist as thin as a reed and a laugh like a bird's, not in tone, in suddenness, stood before the smallest of the long sleeper's offspring and held out her hand as if expecting a shy dog to sniff it. The dragon sniffed. The dragon sneezed in her face, and she laughed and did not wipe it away. The dragon put its head down. "You ride if you can do it without asking the creature to be an instrument," Mela told her afterward. "If you try, you will fall, and you deserve to. If you listen, the wind will remember you and help." The woman listened. She did not fall. She flew out over the sea one morning, and when she came back, the city clapped for the length of a song. And she was mortified and delighted and went to the market to buy fish and tripped on a curb and wept because glory is a strange pair of shoes. The faith of the seven came at last with more than mutterings. A smith's son with wide shoulders and a lined forehead whose creases had formed early because he worried for a living came with a septon and 4 brothers and 2 sisters and a deputation of village elders and stood in the hall. "We do not ask for your worship," he said, before the septon could speak, which made the septon flush with anger that did not suit him in that weather. "We ask for your heat when we cannot keep our babies alive in the second winter." Missandei told him yes. The septon spoke after with all the warmth he could muster and quoted a book. She told him also yes, but to the smith's son's sentence, not to anything else. Later the smith's son sent her a pair of tongs forged from the new steel with a note that said, "In case letters get too hot." She used them to lift the lids on pots and letters and men. The empire no one called an empire needed no walls. It had bridges. It had forges that were never locked. It had glass houses that sweated and sang and gave out spinach in the dead teeth of winter. It had a coin that moved in loops from baker to fishmonger to the woman with no tongue to the boy who counted eggs at the market to the man who swept the hall to the girl who carried firewood to her mother. It had a new set of insults. People began calling one another stone blind when they meant stupid because blindness was not allowed to be an insult anymore in a place where men who could not see could still keep accounts and be useful. They called liars bees because those who lied had learned to buzz until someone swatted them. They called men who wasted heat princes and then stopped using that insult because the princes who remained in the world had learned not to waste heat when they saw what it bought. Once, in deep summer, when the sea was lazy and the air came up from the desert of bones like a dog panting, Daenerys flew alone as far as the ruin at Orys, where men told stories about ghosts that looked like women made of smoke with grief written into their bellies. She found no ghosts. She found heat that had not learned yet how to sing and the skeleton of a creature that had lived under glass and died and still held the shape of its body in fossilized breath. She sat with Drogon and stroked a ridge that weather had gentled and thought about bones and bargains. She had been told once that an empire is bones. She had learned to prefer bread. When she returned, she brought pebbles from the rim of a vent with edges as sharp as knives, and the children used them to cut squashes open with squeals at the wetness within, and the wetness watered the melons, and the melons made a feast, and no one thanked the pebbles, and that was as it should be. There were still fights. There was a riot one year when a tax was levied not in coin but in coal because heat had to be accounted for if it was to be shared. Men shouted that heat is a god's choice and not a woman's schedule. Missandei went into the square with a bowl of snow shaved from the top of a mountain by a woman with more bravery than sense and poured hot wine over it and gave it to the loudest man. He took one spoon and then another and then said he understood taxes, which is a joke as old as fire. The tax stood. Winters came and went, and men got fat in the middle and then lean again and fat again. Women learned to say no in public and slap their own sons in the same breath and be feared and loved for it. The unsullied learned how to be old. When she died, she did not die in war. She did not die in bed either. She died in the air, which is what she would have chosen if she had been asked to choose as a girl. She had grown thin the way old women do when their bodies admit the bargain they cannot keep forever. Her hands ached when the weather went damp, which is a thing people like to tell you when they are proud to have avoided grander aches. She flew with Drogon on a morning when the vent had been singing very low and the glass had not wanted to mist over for once. She did not intend to go far. She went out over the water because the breath coming up from it tasted new, and she liked to bring new tastes back to the children so that they would not think the world had ended because last year's melon had tasted better than this year's. YYR rose from his ledge and went with her without her asking and without his body making any fuss of it. They went out beyond the line where the water changes color when the bottom drops out and becomes bottomless and flew there together, wings making a sound not unlike the ring's note but with more flesh to it. And then she tilted her head to speak some non-thing to Drogon and did not. She did not fall. Drogon felt her become lighter in the way that only something that knows the weight of you for a long time can feel, and lowered his head carefully until she slid into his claw and he could carry her on the cradle of his forelegs the way a man carries a baby. He brought her back to the shore and laid her on the warm glass. The Kept gathered around. Missandei wept where she stood. Grey Worm was all read. Why gone to his ledger's last page. Mela, older than ruin, hummed to the stone. The children came and put their palms on Daenerys' hands and felt the heat leave slowly like a polite guest. They burned her on a table of fused stone. Not because it was tradition, but because the stone had seen her work and deserved to do its part. Drogon watched from near and far. It is not wise to anthropomorphize dragons. They do not grieve as men do. He lowered his head and the air moved very gently. YYR stood at a distance and exhaled one long breath that set the hair on a child's arm dancing. The Kept sang the low song and then the high song and then a song they had made together without saying out loud that they were making it. They did not call her mother. They called her keeper. They called her the one who had remembered that keeping is not owning. They called her bridge. In the north, the bridge hummed differently the night the wind carried the smoke across the sea. Men on it felt the stone under their boots vibrate a fraction and said later to one another that it had been like the sensation you get when your wife shifts in the bed at the far end and you feel the weight change through the straw. The king walked out alone to the middle span and put his palm down and looked up and said nothing. In the morning, there was a letter on his table that had been written before she flew and arrived after. Said only, "Keep." He laughed once, like a bark, and then went to a meeting about whether a new levee should be raised for repairing a road the river had begun to eat. The road was repaired. The Concord continued. It had its own momentum now, and that is what institutions are for, to keep a thing moving when the first hand that pushed it has been taken off the wheel. Missandei led until she could not, and others led after with less grace and then more as the work taught them. The coins were struck with new dates. The Kept grew and died and grew again. Children born the year she flew learned to say kept as a first word and then learned to argue with it the way children argue with the things they rely on. Sometimes the heat went wrong and burned a loaf of bread 20 houses away from the vent. The baker swore and then did not swear because he had bread to sell that afternoon and because swearing does not keep the world. Sometimes a vent closed its throat and had to be reminded that it was part of a body. There were always men who did not want to be part of a body, who thought that their sovereign right was the right to need nothing. They learned, as men always do, that needing nothing means having nothing, and that if they wanted to sit at a table and eat off of plates and not their hands, there must be a woman somewhere who had argued about taxes the week before. In Volantis, a triarch sat at a table with his grandson and taught him to read a column of numbers and then pointed to a note in the margin and said, "This is where she told us no. It saved us more gold than the yes would have, and more men." In Bravos, a woman with a quiet face stood before the vaults of the Iron Bank and thought about letters that had arrived in certain winters and decided to put 2 coins into a smaller bowl labeled forgivable and to write beside them, "Bread sacks." In Qohor, a smith went out onto his stoop at night and listened to the way the wind moved around his anvil and heard in it, at last, the thing he had been listening for since he had been a boy. He woke his apprentice, and the boy grumbled and then listened and then did not. Some men learn quicker. It is not a contest. It is not anything except living. If anyone asks when the empire began, they say different things depending on which part of it their hands have touched most. Some say it began when a girl broke a seal that smelled like resin and read a word and decided to walk toward it. Some say it began when a boy lifted a loaf with hands that had been taught to strike and instead learned to be paid. Some say it began when a dragon put down his throat in front of a woman. He did not know and decided that the language she was speaking might be useful. Some say it began on a bridge where two rulers became carpenters for the length of a morning and measured the lintel together. It does not much matter. There is say and there is keep. The humming of the pipes under the floor stayed the same, and boys and girls learned how to lay their little hands along the tiles to feel whether the heat was enough and not too much, and to adjust the vents with the deftness of people adjusting their own hope. When men far away speak ill of it, their voices are thin and tired. When they come near, they go into the glass houses to thaw their hands in winter and come out with lettuce they did not grow and shame they did not expect to. They go into the halls and hear a case about a broken wheel, and then eat on the steps with men who have fewer teeth than they do and are not yet less happy. They go into the forges and feel their lungs work and their eyes sting and the pride come into their chests because some materials obey no lie. They stand on the vent's rim with Mela's children and put their palms to stone and feel the world breathing and realize that what they had called empire was merely one kind of noise, and that what this is might be a kind of listening. And out on the smoking sea, where the glass flows and hardens and flows again, where the habit of ruin was taught to sit down and breathe with the rest, the dragons go on. They fly, they come back, they are counted by no one and belong to no thing. Sometimes uncertain whether you can see their shadows pass under the surface of the water, which is a sight that makes men drop what they are carrying and swear they have seen God. They have not. They have seen a shadow. Gods do not breathe. Dragons do. Men do. Empires do not. Empires hum. The humming is what you stand on while you do the breathing. If there is PR, officy in any of this, it is this only, that what you keep will be what you sing, and that if you forget to sing, someone else will hum a different keeping and the world will alter its weight toward that tune. Daenerys learned that and remembered it long enough to teach it. The rest was bridges and bread, and men learning to stay inside the act of promise long enough to discover that it tastes better than victory. The rest was a child with dragon spit on her sleeve giggling as if the air had learned to tickle. The rest was a winter with enough potatoes. The rest was a woman writing a number with a dry pen and then licking it because she likes the taste of ink and then making the number add and subtract and multiply into enough houses to trap a bad wind. The rest was kept. And if the world trembles, as it will, as it must, as it always does, there are hands now that know where to touch the stones to make the humming settle. There are voices now that know which note to place against heat. There are bridges now. The singing does not stop. It goes on, quiet as breath, continuous as law when law keeps its own oath, and under it, patient and unowned, the world breathes back.